Hi, Gad.
Hey Bob, how you doing?
Okay, did I fail to pronounce your first name accurately?
Oh, that beautiful. Good job.
I bet you say that to everybody. You told me before we started taping it's somewhere between God and Gad, and I just am not sure I can hit that sweet spot. But anyway, let me introduce us. Your last name is Saad, Saad, which makes me wish it was just Gad for the sake of euphony, I guess. One virtue of your having the name Sad is you can name your podcast The Sad Truth, which is what it's called. Would you not even have a podcast if you didn't happen to have a name that was
That's
conducive to a
right.
great title?
This was not about sharing ideas. It was really about the fact that I was fortunate enough to have a cool name, and hence I was compelled to start a podcast.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I know how you feel. So let me introduce you. You're a professor of marketing at Concordia University, where you occupy the research chair in evolutionary behavioral sciences and Darwinian consumption. I think that's the only chair in the world with that exact name.
That is true.
We're going to talk about two kind of different things today. We're going to talk about consumer behavior. We're also going to talk about religion, the role of religion in motivating behavior, including bad behavior like killing people. People may wonder, well, why are we talking about these two seemingly disparate things? The main reason is you have views about both of them. You've done your actual formal research is more about the consumer behavior, but you have views about both of them. And I think there are some differences of opinion between you and me on the religion question, and I'm always interested in fleshing those out with people. I think you're more closer to the Sam Harris school than I am in terms of how bad religion is. But what's interesting is I think we share, broadly speaking, the same view of human nature. At least, we both identify with evolutionary psychology. There are differences of opinion within evolutionary psychology, but I think, broadly speaking, we have kind of the same foundation. So it's interesting that we disagree on this one manifestation of human nature in the religion area. But why don't we start out by talking about your work, your research, and how you apply a Darwinian view of human behavior to the study of consumer behavior. Maybe you could dive in and talk about some of the stuff about like hormones. And before we back up and talk about a theoretical backdrop for this, maybe just some of the actual kind of on-the-ground research you do about the role of hormones in
Sure.
purchasing decisions.
Sure. So I've done several studies looking at the effects of hormone and consumer behavior. Let me mention a few. So I did a study with one of my former graduate students where we looked at how conspicuous consumption, right, driving a fancy sports car, how conspicuous consumption affects men's testosterone levels when they are the ones who are engaging in the conspicuous act. And then in a second study, what happens to men's testosterone levels when they see another man engaging in a conspicuous act. And the idea here is that testosterone tracks very well whether I win or lose in a competitive interaction, right? So from all sorts of animal studies and human studies, we know that if you and I fight and you win, your testosterone goes up, my testosterone goes down. And so taking this idea across animals and then looking at also the notion of lecking behavior. Lecking behavior, a leck is a physical space where typically males, not always, but typically males congregate, engage in some form of sexual signaling, and then the females choose the optimal male.
That's L-E-K, right?
L-E-K, exactly. And so I took these principles and said, well, let's apply these in consumer behavior. We do a lot of lecking behaviors as consumers. And so with one of my students, we brought men, had them drive. This wasn't, pretend that you were driving, imagine you were driving. We actually rented a Porsche and we had a beaten up old sedan and we had them drive these two cars either in a downtown environment in Montreal on a weekend where everybody can see you being either the loser or the winner, so to speak, or on a semi-deserted highway where it wasn't a public setting, where it wasn't a lek. And then we basically took salivary assays to see how their testosterone levels would fluctuate depending on the driving condition. So that was in study one. I'll restrict our discussion to that one for now. And what we found, not all of our hypotheses were supported, but one that was supported was that you put men in a fancy car, their endocrinological system explodes. But to our surprise, that increase in testosterone happened irrespective of whether it was in the public environment or in the semi-deserted highway. In other words, we had predicted that the increase in testosterone would be much more likely to be the case when people can see you driving the Porsche. Well, it didn't matter. Irrespective of the environment, testosterone went up. Should I wait for you to comment on that, or do you want me to?
Well, let me say one thing. If
Yeah.
people want to read about your research generally in kind of popular form, you wrote a book called The Consuming Instinct. I don't know how much of this research made it into that, but I'm sure a lot did.
It did.
But secondly, yeah. So how did you kind of retroactively explain that finding, if you did? Does it make sense to you now that it really wouldn't matter whether I'm being observed in my BMW or whatever?
So I'm guessing that one of the things that is happening is that you're imbuing these young males with such social status that maybe sort of the endocrinological response is not so granular and so responsive to the fact of, oh gee, it's in downtown Crescent Street, therefore let my testosterone go up, but it's on a highway where only a few passing cars are seeing me. So I think what's basically happening is that it is demonstrating that that mechanism is so powerful. When you imbue me with such an immediate gain in social status by putting me in a Porsche, then my endocrinological system is going to respond accordingly. So then I decided to say, okay, well, that's one example of sexual signaling and hormonal mechanisms on the male side. Let me see if I could look at some hormonal drivers on women's side. And so there, what I did with another doctoral student is I looked at what happens to women's consumer preferences, desires, choices as a function of where they are in their menstrual cycles. Specifically, we looked in that one paper, our data collection was actually much broader, but in that one paper, we looked at beautification. You know, do you dress sexily, scantily clad? Do you beautify yourself? And we also looked at food-related phenomena. The idea being that food-related phenomena map onto survival, natural selection, and beautification maps onto mating and sexual selection. And the big punchline, but we can drill down on some of the findings, is that perhaps not surprisingly, to people who understand animal behavior, when women are in the maximally fertile phase of their menstrual cycles, when they are ovulating, this is when they engage in the greatest amount of beautification. So there you go.
Yeah, okay, so there's a couple of things there. I mean, first of all, let's maybe provide a little more context to the first study. The idea is, I gather, that testosterone, your idea going in is testosterone goes up in certain circumstances to influence the way you will behave around other people, including like display behavior, acting like big and tough, and so on. And so it seemed to make intuitive sense that it would be most prominent in a social situation. And that remains the general view, right, about why testosterone goes up and down under certain circumstances. After you lose a fight, it's in your interest to know, if you lose a fight decisively, it's in your interest to no longer contest it. You're just going to get more mauled, and so your testosterone level drops, and you're more submissive, and so on. And then with the menstrual stuff, I mean, there's a whole body of research here that suggests, and it's a little complicated theoretically, right? Because on the one hand, you would think, yes, when women are most fertile, it makes sense to be in mate attraction mode. It makes the most sense. On the other hand, there's also the fact, this idea that women, there's the kinds of guys they would mate with to actually have their kids, but they might be doing a dual strategy. This is not necessarily at the conscious level, and we're not saying in any of these cases that people are conscious of the motivational logic underlying these things. I mean, that's how the hormones tend to work more subtly than that, but there is this idea that women might, in theory, it would be in a woman's interest to get investment in a certain sense from as many men as possible. I mean, if a woman could in theory have every man in the world under the impression, again, this is kind of an unconscious impression, but anyway, every man in the world acting as if he might be the father of her children, that's a lot of social support, right?
Exactly.
And so there is this theory that the woman might be, again, even unconsciously, discriminating between men she wants to mate with a high chance of actually getting the genes and putting them into the offspring, and then men she wants to mate with just to leave them under the impression that, hey, they should be nice to her kid. And there's some support for that specifically. I mean, I should say. So I wrote a book about evolutionary psychology a long time ago called The Moral Animal. I'm gonna publicize it for you. There you go. God bless you.
Before you go on, can I just tell you a little story about this book?
You can spend the rest of the hour doing that if you
want. So I first was exposed to. Sorry to interrupt you. Please get back to your point in a second. But,
don't worry.
So in 1990, I was a first semester in fall 1990 as a doctoral student at Cornell, And that's when I was first exposed to evolutionary psychology, when a book was assigned to us by my professor of advanced social psychology, Homicide, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Oh, so you studied under Martin Daly and
No, they were
the Martin Daly Margot Wilson book was assigned to you. Okay.
Exactly, by a professor called,
because Martin and Margot were Canadian, but as you are. But anyway,
exactly right,
go ahead.
Exactly right. And so that was sort of my introduction to evolutionary psychology in terms of how you apply these principles to study criminal patterns. And I found the framework so elegant, so parsimonious, and had so much explanatory power that as somebody who wanted to then study consumer behavior, then I had gotten my epiphany. I would then later go on and found the field of evolutionary consumption and so on. But now I finished my PhD in 1994. I get my assistant professorship. And I think in maybe 1995, as I'm starting to busily, develop the field, I go for the first time ever to, I think, Burlington, Vermont is where I bought your book. And so I was at a bookstore. So this is about an hour and a half away drive from Montreal. I see The Moral Animal. I purchase it. I consume it voraciously. And so in sort of the lineage of books of evolutionary psychology, yours, whilst not an academic book, a popularizing book, was sort of really one of the early books that I read and enjoyed. And so to that, I owe you many thanks.
Well, and I owe you thanks for that plug. I mean, I was kind of lucky to get in at the beginning. I actually think my book is the first, it has the term evolutionary psychology in the subtitle. I think it's the first book to have the term evolutionary psychology in either. I started working on that book before I had heard the phrase. I started researching it. The field per se was just taking shape in the late 80s when I started working on the book. And so I went to these conferences. You may have gone to the Human Behavior and Evolution Society conferences. So we were probably both at some of the same conferences. And I guess 1990 was the first one I went to at UCLA. And so it was exciting and interesting because I would just go there and hang out with these people and absorb the ideas, and it hadn't really been put together. And I had the same experience you did. It just makes sense. It just makes sense of all kinds of human behavior. So now back to women cheating on us.
Yeah, I spoke, by the way, you were talking about sort of the term that I would use for what you were describing, and I love the term because it's somebody who teaches consumer behavior, shopping for good genes, right? The word shopping is there. So I think what you spoke of is exactly that. And actually yesterday's class, in an MBA class, I was talking about sort of the cumulative evidence that supports the fact that far from thinking that women are these chaste Victorian prudes, there's actually quite a bit of compelling evidence stemming from many different disciplines that shows that they're also quite interested in sexual variety, as per what you said.
Right. So evolutionary psychology does hold that there are differences between men and women, at least in a statistical sense. But it's not necessarily the stereotype you would hold. And what I was going to say was, so I wrote this book, but I haven't kept up with the field in a fine-grained way because I haven't continued to write about it. But I get bits and pieces of the research come to my attention, and I gather there's a certain body of research suggesting that women are attracted to different kinds of men during the menstrual cycle. I mean, one study found that they're more attracted to men who have the classic physiology of like a high testosterone guy, right?
So that's the Cad versus Dad finding, right?
Right.
So depending on where a woman is in her menstrual cycle, her preference for dads, hence, sort of the less testosterone guy versus the real, Navy SEAL warrior changes. And of course, the finding is that at the maximal point of fertility, that's when she is more interested in the Navy SEAL guy, the Cad.
So they look at things like, I guess, I don't know what the things that correlate with cadness are, but like jaw lines and stuff like you think of some of these quarterbacks like John Elway of the Denver Broncos. I mean, look at the structure of his face. The finding is that kind of guy, that women, when they're actually ready to conceive the child, are more attracted to that kind of guy, and then when they're not, and the sex is I guess more recreational in a sense, but less likely to be productive in a genetic sense, then they're more attracted to like the banker or whoever and a guy who shows signs of the kind of commitment, the kind of emotional commitment that make it likely that he would stick with her and support the child. I mean, this is a terrifying thought from my point of view, but I have to face the facts.
Exactly right. You know, speaking of this testosterone markers on the face, I have an ongoing study which is not yet published. Actually, my student will be defending his thesis shortly on this work that I'm going to describe next. We looked at extreme sports participants. So this is not menstrual cycle. This is going to speak about the testosterone markers. So we looked at extreme sport participants and specific markers of testosterone, such as their 2D, 4D ratios. Are you at all familiar with that literature, or not?
No, I'm not.
No. So the 2D, 4D ratio is what is the ratio between your index to ring finger?
Oh yeah, I actually did surprisingly okay on that.
You mean you were an androgenized male?
No, I came out fairly masculine on that. Like I'm proud to hold up. Okay, go ahead and describe the finding.
I didn't measure them, but that looks pretty virile right there.
Thank you.
So anyway, what we basically did is we looked at digit ratio and also exactly these markers in the face that are markers of being androgenized or not. And regrettably, I'm still sort of going through the thesis, but regrettably, I think we found no differences between the extreme sports participants and sort of the non-extreme sports participants. Our thinking was that the guys who are likely to be interested in doing these types of activities are likely to have greater testosterone markers, because as you know, testosterone serves both as an antecedent and an outcome measure, right? So you could say, if I have higher testosterone, I'm more likely to be an entrepreneur or aggressive. So that's an antecedent. Or it could be an outcome, as per our study with Porsche, right? If I put a guy in a Porsche, his testosterone rises or drops, right? So it's kind of a feedback loop. It's both an antecedent and an outcome measure. And so I was trying to cover the full gamut by doing this study, but I think the results did not cooperate too much.
Okay, but the thing that has been found about digit ratio is what? You're talking about the ratio of the ring finger to the middle finger, is that it?
No, so there are different ratios, but the classic one is the index finger to the ring finger. In women, those two fingers are roughly equal. In men, the ring finger is longer. And so the more there is a difference between these two fingers, now you might say, well, what does that have to do with testosterone? It turns out that morphological trait correlates, and people don't know exactly how. There's been some hypothesized mechanisms, but they correlate with how much exposure you've had to testosterone in utero. And it's been shown, actually, it's been even experimentally manipulated with other species, where you actually go inside an egg and you infuse it with testosterone, and you check the equivalent of a digit ratio in other species. So we do know that there is a strong link. Now, people oftentimes sort of denigrate this research. Typically, they're buffoons, because they sort of associate the digit ratio to palm reading, right? It's some sort of form of phrenology. It's a bunch of quack. I mean, what are you talking about, looking at your hand? And so it's regrettably gotten quite a bit of a bad rap, typically from people who don't really understand the research well.
Okay. But as you said, it's both like an input and an outcome. Hormones like testosterone, also serotonin. So like on the one hand, yeah, you're more likely to go around acting like maybe a stereotypical guy, for better or worse, if you have a high testosterone level. But also, even if you don't, if your environment starts giving you feedback suggesting that acting like a guy is kind of working, or it's going to work in this environment, like you're the dominant guy or whatever, then your hormones adjust to dispose you to act like that, at least for the time being.
Right. Yeah.
So what else? What are some other other things you've worked on?
Other studies. So I've looked at, this is not hormonal stuff, but I've done research looking at gift giving decisions and how we could look at that from an evolutionary perspective. And what I love about gift giving is that it allows one to test several Darwinian mechanisms or modules. And so in my books, I talk about 4 main Darwinian modules: survival, things related to survival, things related to mating, things related to kin selection, and things related to reciprocity. Stuff that you cover beautifully in your own early book.
And we could just quickly say that kin selection explains the evolution of altruism toward kin. Reciprocal altruism explains, on the one hand, you could call it I'll do a favor for you if you'll do a favor for me kind of behavior toward people who aren't necessarily your kin. But again, it's not necessarily conscious. So really, reciprocal altruism explains the evolution of all these emotions that undergird the institution of friendship: a sense of obligation, a sense of initial affection if you share a common interest, and so on. So
exactly right.
Okay, so go ahead.
So in several different papers, so let me sort of unpack how gift giving maps onto these different modules. And so with one of my former doctoral students, I looked at, what are the motives that drive men and women to give gifts to one another. And we divided the motives into tactical motives and situational motives. Situational motives would be, well, it's your birthday, and it's a situation that demands it, so I'm giving you a gift. Tactical motives would be, well, because I'm trying to seduce you, I'm trying to have sex with you, I'm trying to exhibit generosity, and so on, right? Not surprisingly, men score much more highly on the tactical motives than do women. There are no sex differences when it comes to situational variables. Now, here's the interesting part. When you ask men, why do you think women give you gifts? They infer the same motive. In other words, they don't have a good theory of mind when it comes to that ritual. They think that when a woman gives me a gift, it's because, well, she's trying to seduce me. On the other hand, women are blissfully aware that the reasons why men give them gifts are different from the reasons why they give gifts to men. And so we hypothesize in a post hoc manner that it makes evolutionary sense that that would be the case, because there is a real cost to women not understanding the minefield of that ritual, right? I mean, if you were to succumb to every charmer who gives you flowers and says, trust me, I'm going to love you forever, now let's go behind the shed and have massive sex, then that's not going to be a very good sort of judicious strategy of mate choice, right? And so from that perspective, it makes sense in this context for men to be a lot more poorly calibrated when it comes to the dynamics of that ritual.
Yeah, I mean, you could view what the men are doing as a kind of one instance of a more general tendency for them to sometimes overestimate their chances with women, because in a lot of circumstances, if you just kind of do the math, you're better off in crude, genetic terms, if you imagine, all sex actually leading or having a real chance to lead to reproduction, as it would have before the invention of contraception, to varying degrees, of course, depending on where the woman is in her cycle. But still, if you imagine real genetic stakes, then it makes sense for guys to be willing to fail several times if in the 1 in 10 time, the 1 in 11 time they succeed at getting the sex. And again, because it's not a matter of conscious calculation, the way that manifests itself is in various things, some of them emotional and some of them cognitive distortions, right?
Exactly. And just to give a term to what you just described, in case you don't know it, or perhaps your viewers don't know it, what you just described is called error management theory. And so, for example, the fact that men ascribe sexual interest when women smile at them falls under exactly what you just stated, right? And so that whole class of, misreadings of these dynamics falls under error management theory. So you're exactly right. And so for those of you who might be interested in sort of an academic reading of this stuff, Marty Hazelton, who is a former student of David Buss, one of the pioneers of evolutionary psychology, has done a lot of interesting work on this exact topic.
Yeah. And I mean, an example of that is like, when you're a male and you get to a point in your career where maybe you have either subordinates who actually work for you or people who want to curry favor with you because it's in their interest. Like, if a young woman acts, really like impressed and reverential and everything, you do find yourself thinking, like maybe she's interested in me, and then you realize, wait a second, she's behaving exactly, more or less, the way the young males are behaving, who are being very deferential and sucking up, and I'm not thinking they want to have sex with me, right? I mean, it's the mind is just a total reality distortion field in some respects. I don't want to overstate it, but it's certainly I mean, I'm actually finishing a book on Buddhism, and it becomes very relevant there, because one thing Buddhism and evolutionary psychology have in common is the view that the mind is not a naturally reliable guide to reality. And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm done. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I want to get back to the gift giving, but since you mentioned perceptual distortions, let me discuss an ongoing study that I have, actually with the same former doctoral student with whom I just described the gift giving stuff with. His name is Tripat Gill. So so let me give you kind of the background. There's research that's been done in the past, I can't remember exactly by whom, where they took the same guy, brought him into a classroom, and they introduced him with one of several possible academic status. So, he's just a, lecturer, he's a full professor, right? And then they would ask people in the room to whom he had been introduced, how tall do you think this guy is? And of course, what they found is that the exact same guy, he doesn't suddenly become taller or shorter. Perceptually, we view him as taller as his social status goes up. Okay, so I took this, very clever little study with a beautiful finding. I said, well, let's see if we can take this exact idea, and since, of course, I study consumer behavior, apply it in a consumer behavior context. Now, how would we do that? So we created two online dating profiles of the exact same guy, where the only thing that changed is a photo of his favorite possession, because, this is how he's trying to talk about himself. And it was either a fancy, red Porsche, or a very non-fancy red Kia, I think. And then we asked men and women to rate this target on a whole bunch of cues and traits, one of which was their perception of his height. Now, here's the really interesting finding. Men shortened him because, at least the Porsche. If
he had the fancy car?
If he had the fancy car, exactly.
Because they think he's overcompensating for insecurity?
Well, it could be that's the, okay. my penis is smaller if I'm driving a fancy. No, I think it's because when you are facing a guy of high status, that's when you feel threatened as a male, and then the derogation strategies that kick in should be consistent with that. And therefore, this guy Robert is driving a Porsche, well, he must be some little short shrimp, he's not a serious guy, right? And so therefore, because I know that height is all other things equal associated with high status, I derogate you this way. On the other hand, in women's case, which we call the status elongation effect, suddenly the guy became much taller. So the exact same stimulus perceptually changed in completely different ways depending on whether I'm a man or a woman. It would be very difficult to come up with this finding where you're not coming from an evolutionary perspective.
Yeah, that would make sense. So David Buzz, who I think maybe wrote the preface or introduction to your book or something, or did he?
Consuming Instinct, yes.
Yeah. So he did early work on what he called the derogation of rivals, and it's another example of how males. And this can work with females too, but he was studying males initially, I think. Males have rivals, and it isn't just that they go, well, it's in my tactical interest to go around derogating them so people will think less highly of them. They tend to believe the derogation, right? It saves a lot of time to just believe what you're saying, right? And
self-deception, right?
Right. And so it's another example of that. On the earlier point of male perception of female interest, it's also a finding that females, that a male's perceived status does factor into their attraction to the male. So it's not like you're necessarily entirely hallucinating, the male that is, in all cases, if they see a woman seeming to acknowledge his status. But at the same time, as we said, it makes sense for males to overestimate romantic and sexual prospects. It even when they just see a woman from a distance, they found that males just tend to assume the best because, but in terms of how they will ultimately rate the attractiveness, they'll see a woman from distance and go, oh, she's attractive, and that's in tactical terms that succeeds in getting the male close enough to at least find out.
Well, and it's a preparatory mechanism, right? To the extent that in the dynamics between men and women, men are expected to be the ones who are the wooers. Then, right. if I don't, at the very least, engage in self-deception that she may be interested in me, then I don't have the preparatory mechanism to muster up the courage to approach her. And so it makes perfect sense, even when it seems that I am reading the situation to do so, if only because that has to be the mechanism by which it compels me to try to get her, right?
But then how do you explain somebody like me who throughout high school and for some of my adult life was terrified at the thought of actually approaching women?
Well, I think because to most people, so I don't think you're the only one, certainly most men, rejection is quite an injurious thing, right? It's very rare the guy who could sort of apply the machine gun strategy, hit on as many women as possible, knowing that statistically one will accept it, right? If I think you're a proud person, then you maybe don't wish to be exposed to the endless tsunami of rejection that you're going to face. So I think you're perfectly normal for having been fearful.
I'm glad to hear that. I mean, I think it wasn't that I ruled out the possibility they would be interested in me. It was just that the prospect of rejection was terrifying. Painful, but enough about me.
So you want to go back to gift giving?
Sure, sure.
Yeah. So another thing that we looked at in that same paper, and then I want to talk about another gift giving paper, is we created a hypothetical budget allocation situation. We said, look, if you had $1,000 that you had to spend on your gift-giving budget for the next Christmas season or whatever, how would you allocate that $1,000 across all people to whom you might give gifts? And the idea was to then see whether there's sort of a hierarchy of Darwinian importance to different recipients, right? And so what we found, and this is where the different Darwinian modules kick in, people give the most to their mate, right? I mean, that's sort of direct reproductive fitness. The second class of people that they give the most to are close kin. So that's kind of the kin selection stuff. The next are close friends. That's the reciprocity angle. And then later you've got further kin. So it's not the case that any kin, outguns close friends. And that's why, as you said at the start, that's why friendship is so important to a social species like humans. So that was that one paper. And then in a more recent paper, which we've yet to publish, it's probably the paper that I've had the most trouble publishing, despite the fact that it has some of the most simple and elegant and clear findings that you could think of. And I think it's because of some people who have a bit of antipathy or a lot of antipathy towards EP that are putting some roadblocks.
Evolutionary psychology.
Sorry, evolutionary psychology. My apologies, yes. So in this paper, it's gift giving at Israeli weddings, right? And we have actual data from 30 weddings, right? Where imagine an Excel sheet where you have how much money, because in the Israeli context, they don't give you toasters and a coffee machine. They give you money. Here's $120, here's $200. And so they had the actual data on, Uncle Mordechai gave $200, Hannah, my sister, gave $80. And so what we did is we tested two hypotheses. The first one is a similar finding to what I just talked about in terms of budget allocation. Closer kin give more money than further kin, so that kind of replicates that finding. Fine, that's nice. We're doing it in a new context, new culture with field data. Fine. The second hypothesis, there is no way someone could have posited that hypothesis where you're not coming from an evolutionary perspective. So here's how it goes. So if you look at, for example, your 4 grandparents, from a genetic relatedness perspective, they're all equally related to you. They share 1/4.
In theory.
Right, exactly. See, that's it. I think you know where I'm going with this. And so it's 0.25, right? On average, I share 1/4 of my genes with each of my 4 grandparents. But if you recognize that it's not only genetic relatedness, but genetic assuredness that matters, right? How assured are you of the link? Well, then your maternal grandmother has 2 generations of maternity certainty, whereas your paternal grandfather has 2 generations of paternal uncertainty, and the 2 other are in between. And so there's tons of research that has found that the pattern of investments are exactly according to that. Maternal grandmothers give the most, paternal grandfathers give the least. Go ahead.
So the core idea being just, again, that for sure that your mother is your biological mother. You don't know, I mean, assuming you trust that actually you came out of her womb, and usually that's a pretty well-established fact. You don't know for sure that your father is your biological father, and there's been all kinds of, I remember, I think Malinowski, the anthropologist, found that on the Trobriand Islands, there's a system where, I think there was so much promiscuity that paternity confidence was very low, and what he found was that women got a lot of investment support from their brothers for their kids, more than they got for their kids from their sisters. There was a system that, and if you look at that, that's people investing in kids that they know they're closely related to, even if they're not the fathers, they're the uncles. But so there's a, and again, it's interesting to, I mean, the assumption is that a lot of this is unconscious. You don't. And then, I mean, speaking of Israel, I'm not saying this is connected, but there is this idea, right, that you're Jewish if your mother is Jewish.
Exactly.
But if your father is Jewish but your mother isn't Jewish, then what is the deal? Is conversion required or what?
So in today's sort of conversion practice at the sort of the most orthodox level, I mean, you cannot be Jewish unless you go through that Orthodox formal conversion, unless your mother is Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
So you're exactly right. As I understand it, but I could be wrong, I think in earlier times, I don't know exactly when, that sort of through the mother lineage idea was not quite as set.
Okay.
We could check on that.
I really want to emphasize that with things like this, you never know. I mean, cultural things develop for arbitrary reasons. It may happen that they just happen to make sense in Darwinian terms. So I want to be careful. But certainly what you found in your study there are different kinds of data that suggest that maybe at an unconscious level we are attentive to this fact that you only know for sure that your
maternal side.
Yeah, the maternal side. I mean, I was just trying to think through as I was saying that how I behaved toward my various nieces, nephews, in-laws, and so on. People can do that little game for themselves if they really want to think about it.
So just so I can formally state it, so then we looked at the maternal and the paternal side of the wedding guests of the bride and groom, and we hypothesized that the maternal side of both the bride and groom would give larger gifts across different kid categories than the paternal side, and that's exactly what we found. There's absolutely no reason why this paper has been so roadblocked endlessly for years. Rerun it here, redo this, reanalyze, it's endless hoops that we're jumping through. Frankly, at one point, and I'll say this publicly, at one point, the lead author on this paper just really insisted that we withdraw it from the journal that we were at because we were being put through an unreasonable number of hoops. But finally, we were dogged. We went back to the journal, but it is still under review. So if anybody's looking for it, it's not yet published.
So are these like mainstream psychology journals with not a particular evolutionary psychology? Because there are journals that are more sympathetic to evolutionary psychology.
No, this is actually a consumer psychology journal.
It's a consumer psychology journal.
And therefore, yes, it's psychology, but it's not evolutionary based. And if you have the misfortune of falling on one or two or sometimes three reviewers or associate editors or editors who are, have great animus towards evolutionary psychology, well, then the hurdle that you have to overcome is that much greater, if not impossible. Mm-hmm. And now, of course, as I like to say, sort of optimistically, but truthfully, the amount of animus that I faced, earlier in my career is markedly more so then than it is now. In other words, a greater number of people are now coming around. And I'm not talking here about the people at the human behavior and evolution meetings. They're on board. But I'm talking about, many of the social scientists, the cultural anthropologists, the social psychologists, the consumer psychologists, who are not in the least bit steeped in evolutionary theory, while it's been a difficult pill for them to swallow that consumers might actually be biological beings shaped by evolutionary forces.
Yeah, no, I remember in the early days when it was very much a kind of besieged, there was a kind of, it was kind of fun. I mean, it was a renegade movement. This is like late 80s, early 90s. And I think it's gotten to the point where, at least in most psychology departments, professors at least make respectful noises. They don't dismiss evolutionary psychology out of hand the way they used to, even though it often turns out they haven't really thought about it a lot. But it's no longer considered something you can just dismiss.
Right.
So should we turn to religion a little?
We
don't have a ton of time left, but maybe we could sketch out some of the issues, and then maybe we'll have time to pick it up later at another conversation or something.
That'd be great.
So I guess broadly speaking, you could say the question is religion, good or evil? And I've always, I have some kind of Darwinian reasons, I think, disagree with Sam Harris's interpretation. We can get to those, but first of all, it's just the difficulty of the problem empirically. So it's like, if the question is religion the root of a bunch of bad behavior, or is it on balance a bad influence? Well, there's two things you have to do. First, it seems to me, you'd ideally, in an ideal world, you'd like add up the number of good things that have been done in the name of religion and the number of bad things that have been done in the name of religion. Well, that's hopeless empirically, right? I mean, that's a really difficult thing to do in the first place. But then you'd have to get at the stubborn question of like, well, when people say they're doing something in the name of religion, is it really being done in the name of religion or not? And there's various complications there. So to begin with, and I'll just say, I've read the Hitchens book and I've read Sam's stuff. I just haven't seen anybody actually take the problem on systematically with due respect for its difficulty. I haven't even seen, Hitchens' book I just think is a travesty. I mean, it's just anecdote after anecdote, and he dismisses the way he handles Martin Luther King and says, okay, well, Martin Luther King did this in the name of religion, but that wasn't really in the name of religion. It's just, or religion couldn't have been the real motivator because of X, Y, Z. I'm not aware of anybody really addressing the question as systematically as it needs to be addressed and with the humility that I think is in order.
So, yeah, so much to cover. I think we need another 6 hours for this.
Yeah,
one, but,
so let's just start the conversation.
Let's start, yeah, and then we'll pick it up another time. So in chapter 8 of The Consuming Instinct is a chapter that perhaps some would say provocatively titled, Marketing Hope by Selling Lies. And so there what I do is I talk about various peddlers of hope that are very successful because ultimately they deceive you, but they really serve a purpose that I really would love to believe in, right? So cosmetics companies sell me hope, right? I mean, I think it was the Estee Lauder, or I can't remember who it was, who said, in the manufacturing plant, we manufactured the actual cosmetics. In our advertisements, we sell hope, right? Self-help gurus do the same thing. And of course, the greatest, in my view, peddler of hope is religion, and that ultimately, for you and I, it might sound obvious what I'm saying, but for many people, they might not have connected the dots. It solves, in quotes, the ultimate problem, and that is our respective existential angst, right? If I have a cholesterol problem, I go see my physician, here is some Lipitor, try to eat healthily, exercise, take Lipitor, and boom, it's solved. Well, there's this pill called religion, which if you take, solves your mortality problem because you're going to see Uncle Chaim again or whomever it is. You're going to see Fido, the dog that passed away in heaven. And so I think it's, functionally speaking, there are very compelling arguments for why we should believe in religion. But then the question becomes, is it, if you truly believe that it's a bad idea or a false idea, not bad in the sense of how you're saying it, that, the accounting of what it does is good or bad, but rather, is it a veridically true, is it true or not? Then my thinking is, and maybe I'm maladaptively honest here, because I think it's easier to believe than to not believe. My thinking is, I'm not going to believe in a fairy tale because it makes me feel good. My dog passed away a few years ago, and it was devastating to me. I would much rather believe that there will be some future time when I will be running in the fields with him. And that's a lot more comforting to me than to know I will never see my dog again. And so I think because of this large prefrontal cortex that we are endowed with, it's very difficult to eradicate religion. It's here to stay, and only the few walk away from it.
Yeah, I don't disagree so much with that as that it is the view that it's the source of badness, and when people do bad things in the name of religion, the thing to focus on is eradicating the religious belief and convincing them that it's superstition and stuff. I mean, I think good luck for reasons you said. I mean, all the evidence is that only tends to make people more fundamentalist and extremist when they feel that their beliefs are threatened. And B, I think that takes your attention away from things that might help and that might be more fundamentally related to the actual causes of the behavior. Right. So, well, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was going to say, so we could make it tangible by talking about a specific context, right? So I have here actually for me, and I prepared this. I had it both as one of my sad truth clips, but I'm now using it in an upcoming talk that I'll be giving at a terrorism conference here in Montreal, where I listed all of the purported motives that people have ascribed to the endless global mayhem that has been committed in the name of one, shh, don't you dare say it. It's redacted. We shouldn't say what the name of that ideology is. And so, frankly, that's laughable, right? Because, I mean, I could just go through some of these, right? It's people join ISIS for adventure seeking, for male bonding. It's workplace violence. It's violent video games. It's lack of adequate exposure to art. It's beard bullying, and I could go on through this. It's poverty, it's climate change, it's lack of solar panels. So when you have people who are so committed to not even entertaining the possibility that when people tell you, look, I am going to do action X because of passage Y in my book, and here is the quote, then I think this is what I call a manifestation of ostrich castrati behavior, right? You're castrated in that you are too cowardly to see the truth, and ostrich, even though ostriches don't really put their head in the sand, the metaphor is appropriate, you wish to deny reality. So I think there is a danger. I mean, I agree with you that in some cases we shouldn't necessarily ascribe certain behaviors to religion, but also we shouldn't do the opposite, which is, you know, just endlessly come up with just laughable. I mean, I couldn't come up with satire as poignant as some of the causes that have been inscribed. You know, when a jihadist says, this is why I'm doing it. I'm actually making a video, a public video. I'm going to quote the passage that drives me to go to Raqqa and throw those Shia dog homosexuals off the rooftops. That has nothing to do with religion. It's due to male bonding. Well, come on, man. Let's be honest.
So you think we should take them at their word about what their motivation is?
Well, certainly, no. I mean, wouldn't that make sense?
Well, but it seems to me you and I just spent a long time agreeing that the mind often deceives itself about its actual motivation.
So what you're saying is that they might use religion, but perhaps they could be, and I'm asking this not facetiously, genuinely. Yeah. So, for example, to the extent that I can go to this foreign land, engage in thrill-seeking, maybe get access to many women who otherwise I would not have access to in my dull life. So I don't deny that, incidentally, right? I mean, obviously, look, even the promises of paradise can be, and I'm sure you'll agree with this, can be analyzed via a Darwinian lens, right? I mean, do action X and then get all of your Darwinian desires met in the afterlife, right? And by the way, there are sex differences in what is promised to men who do these things versus women, precisely because whomever is coming up with these promises, whether it be Allah or someone else, is a Darwinist, and he recognizes that the selling points that you have to offer men are different from women. So I concede that point to you, but we certainly can't say that none of this stuff is related to religion, right? I mean, no one is going to read that. Let me plug your book again. It's difficult to get radicalized by reading The Moral Animal, correct?
Well, I hadn't thought about that. You can imagine people getting radicalized. You know, people in American politics are getting radicalized. People who are secular are acting kind of radically. It happens. But I mean, to get back to the point, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, I think we agree that actually, yes, some of the enticements. I mean, I was surprised to hear you dismiss the male bonding part. I think that does factor in. You know, I think a lot of times you're talking about people who you know, a lot of them, things aren't going great in one sense or another. They may be a little alienated. They whatever, and they find the overall prospect attractive. I mean, certainly when ISIS recruits people, they're advertising, in addition to like heaven, a whole lot of mundane things. As you said, there are women, money, and so on. So there's that. But
can I interrupt you there?
Yeah.
I'll finish your point.
I would also add, it is part of my Darwinism. It's part of my ebb-psych perspective that when someone says, I'm doing X because of Y, just by virtue of the structure of the sentence, I am skeptical. If a politician says, I am running for office because I want to make America a better place, I want to help people, it isn't that I think they don't believe what they're saying. It's that I think that, you know, how convenient that that happens to coincide with elevating their status and power.
Right.
We are designed to believe things and profess to believe things that have various kinds of social and Darwinian benefits. So I just am out of the box skeptical of people's reports about their own motivation. There's a bunch of other stuff I could say, but I'll stop there and let you say what you're going to say.
So I do concede actually that male bonding is part of the motives, that the constellation of motives. But here's the thing, right? There are 10,000 religions. It's a lower estimate, and you're better equipped to speak about this than I am. You wrote a book called The Evolution of God, so I'm sure that your understanding of the rich tapestry of religions is quite profound. So let's put the number at 10,000, although that's a lower estimate of the number of religions that exist. So out of the 10,000 religions that we can right now write down, there seems to be one that expresses its male bonding by throwing off dirty Shia from the rooftops, right? Therefore, the Amish are not male bonding through that mechanism. Neither are the Seventh-day Adventists, neither are the Raelians, nor are the Jains. And therefore, male bonding could be a mechanism by which I join ISIS that drives it, but ultimately it has to be under the rubric of an ideology that allows my desire to male bond to express itself in that form. So again, no one contests the fact that that religion is not the sole singular fact that is driving people, but surely we can't remove it, right? I mean, what would be the data that a skeptic would need to collect before they come to the conclusion that religion might have something to do with it? And I'm asking you this genuinely, not facetiously, right? So if I look at the history of all scientific papers that have ever been studied, well, the amount of evidence that was needed to publish any paper is profoundly lesser than the amount of evidence that we have currently that there might be a link between this ideology and terrorism. So what would be the data that would make you say, you know what, I do see a link, I'm convinced that this is partly a motive for why they do what they do?
So are you saying your critique is not so much of religion as of one religion? You're saying Islam is more conducive to violent behavior?
Well, I mean, we could compare specific religions, so let's make it simple. We could say, and so I'll come back to your question in a second, the content of a religion is relevant to tell us about the religion, right? So, for example, I eat pork, yet I'm Jewish. The fact that I eat pork does not in any way inform the question of whether Judaism allows the consumption of pork or not, because I eat pork despite my religious identity, correct? Therefore, if I want to know whether Judaism permits or not the consumption of pork, I have to go to the main text. So by the same logic, I could use a content analysis, very scientific method, where I take Buddhist ideology, or I take Islam, I take the Hadith, I take the Quran, I take the Sirah, the biography of Muhammad, and I could put it through a content analysis that tells me how often are there messages of brotherhood, tolerance, and love and peace versus genocidal hatred. And I could genuinely compare that to Buddhism or Judaism or Raelianism and come up with, so I don't need to use...
so you're saying Islamic texts are more supportive of genocidal hatred?
Than what? Than James? Well, yes.
Well, the only case I'm aware of where genocide per se is explicitly embraced is in the Old Testament, where it says, if you find a people who worship the wrong God, you kill all the men, all the women, and all the livestock in that town. There's nothing like that in the Quran.
Well, so you're right about the Old Testament, and actually there's a gentleman, his name is Bill Warner, he's a former physicist, he was a professor of physics, who later in his life, when he retired, started applying this content analysis approach to studying religious texts. You should really check him out, I think you'd enjoy his work. He's looked at the content analysis of the Old Testament, and as you correctly said, it's not pretty, right? Now, the idea is, what is it that causes people who otherwise affiliate themselves with the Old Testament, whether it be Christians, or, you know, and then the New Testament, or Jews with only the Old Testament, that doesn't cause them to, all over the world, take those texts seriously, right? Now, in the Quran, we can discuss whether there's genocide or not, but surely at least we can agree that it is difficult to read those texts and assume that it is simply made up of John Lennon, Hold Hand, and Imagine, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're not going to play the game. I mean, I could quote you the
No,
stuff.
I mean, what I said in The Evolution of God is that if you want to look at like quantity of exhortations to violence, like on a per page basis, it's higher in the Quran. If you want to look at, at it qualitatively, the explicit, very explicit advocacy of utter and complete annihilation, I would say that there's more of that in the Old Testament. But I mean, I think you're saying, I mean, there's two different issues here. There's the textual thing, which is as it is. I mean, people can go do the math if they want to go read this stuff. But and then there's the question of how much of a motivation that is. And I'm not saying it's irrelevant, but your earlier, a key part of your argument is that, like, right now, more violence done in the name of religion is coming out of Islam. First of all, I'd want to note that historically there have been times when a lot of violence was being done in the names of other religions, and their texts have not changed since then.
Right.
So there's clearly tremendous fluctuation.
Yes.
And there have been times early, not so long ago, when there wasn't that much coming out of Islam. So clearly text is not determinative. It's not enough.
Well, it's always an interaction between.
Sure.
It's just like, I mean, let's bring it back to evolutionary theory, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of people who don't understand evolutionary psychology think that it is biological determinism, right? If you say that something is evolutionary based, then you're doomed. It's fatalism. You're doomed to doing it. We're doomed to cheat on our monogamous unions because there's an evolutionary explanation for sexual variety. And of course, the correct answer, as you certainly know, is that, of course, it's an interaction, right? I mean, even genes get turned on or off depending on environmental inputs. Mm-hmm. And so to link it back to your point about Islam, of course, it's an interaction. It's an interaction between a particular historical period and those texts. It's an interaction between an individual and how he or she wishes to understand that text. And so that's where you get a lot of the nuance. That's why you get that out of 1.6 billion people, very few people are doing horrible things and most are peaceful and tolerant, correct?
Right.
So that, of course, I concede. But for anybody to argue that, for example, it is contentious or unclear whether if I did a statistical analysis of all the global mayhem around the world, whether there will be a profoundly clear champion of global mayhem, well, then they live on another planet called Bizarro World.
Well, okay,
right? I mean,
but as a social scientist, I'm sure you'd agree that before you attribute the causality to the religion that wins that contest, you would want to control for as many variables as possible.
Right.
And it's one thing that's pretty clear is that the average Muslim country, as of 50 years ago, 80 years ago, was not at as high a level of technological development, economic development, as, say, the United States or Canada. So that's like a really important thing right there that could make you question whether you can, how much emphasis you can put on any given variable. But and then there's the particular circumstances you can point to in a given case. So, and here's an example I'd use to point to the pitfalls of assuming we can take our word for people about what their ultimate motivation is. Okay, so let's take Israel-Palestine. I think the things that everyone can agree on is there was a conflict over land. A lot of Palestinians were displaced from their home. Many of them wound up in the West Bank. And then, through subsequent events having to do with war, the West Bank came under the control of Israel. So you've got people who were displaced from their homes against their will, who are now occupied by the ethnic group that displaced them. Okay, now if you look at Palestinians who commit violence because of this, you can hear a lot of them say Allah Akbar or whatever and say they're doing it in the name of religion. On the other hand, when the tension first broke out, it was much more often done in the name of nationality. It's become a more religious thing over time, but killing is killing. And it's interesting that initially, so like Sirhan, who assassinated Robert Kennedy, precisely because of Kennedy's views on Israel, he, by his own account, said, I did it for my nation. and he was a Christian. Okay,
Right.
so so you know, it's like, and the other thing I'd say is, like, leave that aside. Leave the fact that, I mean, one point I'm making is that religion can function just as an ethnic marker. And people can say, I'm doing this because of my religion, but the real significance is just that religion was the group they identified with. The group has been displaced or, in their view, mistreated or whatever else. So that's what they're talking about. Okay, so we really have to distinguish between religion as an ethnic marker and religion as an ideologically motivating thing. And just the final thing I'd say about this is, so like if right now you went and looked at the violence by Palestinians that's committed in the name of religion and said, if it weren't for religion, that violence would not have happened, that would just be a stunningly naive thing to say, because we know historically that when you have a situation like this, an ethnic group is displaced, and then worse still from their point of view, they're now occupied by the displacers, you're going to get violence. It would not matter if they were, even if they were atheists, you would still get some violence. So the idea, if your position is we have to take their word, and right now they're calling it religious motivation, I'm sorry, that's just not consistent with what we know, which is that circumstances like this lead to conflict, right?
Right. So even if I conceded that the Israeli-Palestine conflict, the animus of the Palestinians towards the Israelis was strictly due to, historical reasons related to land and occupation, even if I conceded that, which I don't, because there is an element that is tied very much to religious hatred, in addition to some of the things that you mentioned, I could right now list, and I've got it here in front of me, 50 plus countries where terrorist attacks have taken place, where every single possible covariate that you might propose, I could control for. So, for example, why is it in Thailand there are terrorist attacks, and why did it happen in Belgium amongst third generation supposedly assimilated Muslims? And I could go through 50 countries spanning every possible economic condition, every possible political system, every possible linguistic, cultural, social heritage. I could control for all the variables. We would still come up with a very clear reality that there is one group of people that associate themselves with one particular ideology that are extraordinarily more likely to commit acts. Now, the data is so unequivocally clear that if that data does not convince one to at least tentatively accept the possibility that there might be a link between the ideology and religion, between the ideology and terror, then all of the papers that have ever been published in all scientific fields should be retracted, because they don't have as much evidence to support that publication as what I just told you. So again, nobody is contesting the fact that there are endless. The world is complex, and religion does not solely explain what we're talking about. But at least we can both sort of leave the conversation saying it certainly has something to do with it, right? So, for example, when politicians, American politicians on both sides of the aisle, get up and say, this ideology has nothing to do with this reality because it is a religion of peace, that is a demonstrably false statement. And
well,
we should.
You're arguing with the wrong guy. I've never called anything a religion of peace. I mean, in fact, I think part of the problem on both sides is having an essentialist view of religion. All religions are incredibly malleable. They have all kinds of manifestations. They lead people to do wonderful things in their name and horrible things in their names. At different periods of history, different religions are doing more horrible stuff. But I am certainly not, I've never said that any religion is a religion of peace. And I don't deny, and I'm not one who's saying that every time the word jihad appears, what it really refers to is a struggle within the soul, There is a doctrine of military jihad that evolved. The doctrine per se is a coherent doctrine. It's not found in the Quran, but it developed in Islamic law. There's no doubt about that. On the other hand, as I emphasize, it's incredibly malleable in its manifestation. And this, I guess, we shouldn't go on forever, but this gets back to my view that, I see my view as very consistent with evolutionary psychology in the sense that I view the human mind as very pragmatic in the sense that people, they sense, well, of course, it's meeting various social needs, but one thing people do is they sense, like, allies, potential allies, they sense enemies, potential enemies. The belief structure that facilitates bonding with the allies and fighting with the enemies is itself, I think, a very malleable thing. And it's in that sense that I've always said that evolutionary psychology has a little bit of Marxism in it, right? The idea that like ideas and ideologies and so on are in some sense not quite epiphenomenal, but they're almost superstructure. What's going on at the flesh and blood level underneath is people sensing, like, wait a second, I can get status doing this. I can ally with those guys to get more power doing this. These guys are my enemies. There's that, but then there's also all the proximate mechanisms that realize that. So things like, I want respect. That's built into us. I want respect. And, with Palestinians, that's a huge thing. I often say with Israelis, the big thing is fear. With Palestinians, the big thing is respect. Both of those things are very fundamental. And if and I just think that sustains a lot of the hostility that then goes under the name of religion. Now, I certainly can see that there are certain religious doctrines that have specific effects. If you didn't think you were going to heaven, you would not become a suicide bomber. That's true. Also, if you didn't think you were going to heaven, there are probably a lot of people who would have done fewer good things than they did in hopes of getting to heaven. But I certainly don't deny that kind of effect. And look, it would be better if there weren't, if suicide bombing were a tactic that was off the table, that would be better. That is an effective religion that I don't deny. But I really think that the view from evolutionary psychology is one that should make you skeptical of people's professed motivations and attentive to deeper dynamics.
I think next time when we chat, if we get a chance to chat next time, we should probably lead off with what you're attempting to do there, which is sort of reconcile evolution and religion, because as you know, but many of our viewers may not know, I talked about this briefly in some of my books and in one of my clips, that evolutionists study religion, right? Typically when we think about evolution and religion, we think of them as sort of enemies, right? Mortal enemies. It's either evolution or religion. But of course, religion is very important to human affairs, and therefore evolutionists are profoundly interested in understanding what are the evolutionary roots, the evolutionary genesis, if I may, of religion. So I think that might be a very nice angle to take up the conversation next time.
Yeah, let's leave it there, because there are actually different views within evolutionary psychology, exactly. And I have one, and I'm honestly not sure I can predict yours based on
So what are you an adaptationist or an exaptationist?
I think as you mean that, I think I'm more an exaptation. I mean, I think it's more of a spandrel. I don't think it's fundamentally a group selection level adaptation as some people do. There's an appendix in my book, The Evolution of God, where I lay out my view. But
so you're on the side of Pascal Boyer, right? That evolution is piggybacking on mechanisms that have evolved for other purposes.
The cultural evolution of religion is piggybacking on things that evolved largely for other reasons. Now, I don't deny that a kind of group selection takes place over history, kind of cultural group selection, which is the groups that have belief systems that are conducive to harmony and efficiency and so on, may outcompete other groups. But that competition may happen at the cultural level. In other words, the other group just adopts their culture, goes, yeah, well, that religion works fine, as opposed to being extinguished physically and it happening through genetic evolution. But
and for those who don't know, by the way, the gentleman who proposed what you just said is David Sloan Wilson. He's probably the strongest proponent of that argument.
Of the group selectionist.
The group selectionist.
Right.
Exactly.
Right, yeah. That's right. He wrote a book called Darwin's Cathedral.
Exactly right. Yeah.
So maybe we should wait a little while.
Get people to miss us, and then we hit them with number 2.
Let's wait until they're begging. Let's wait.
Sounds good.
Let's wait until they're absolutely begging.
And as they're begging, by the way, I will insist that they beg on Twitter using my preferred gender pronoun. I don't know if you followed the whole debacle of the gender pronoun issue. I know we're
I know you're anti-political correctness.
Yeah. So there's a professor at University of Toronto who refuses to address people by their preferred gender.
Is that Jordan Peterson?
Jordan Peterson, who was on my show actually. And so if you're going to beg for a part 2 to the Robert Wright Gad Saad, please address me by my preferred pronoun. It's on my Sad Truth clip. If you don't do it, then we won't hold the chat.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. Well, you tell me whether they've met your strict prerequisites, and if they have, we'll do this again. So speaking of Twitter, what's your Twitter handle?
So at Gad, G-A-D, S-A-A-D, and they could check out my Sad Truth, S-A-A-D Truth channel on YouTube.
On podcast, okay, which is available both in audio and video on YouTube, I think. And not that anyone asked, but if they want to follow me on Twitter, it's Robert Writer.
Yeah, well, what is that? Is that because there are many Robert Wrights, and so you need?
I was not the first Robert Wright to discover Twitter, apparently. But there's also the pun. I write for a living, writer. I'm writer than you, for example. So there's 2 right there.
Right. Very nice. Very nice.
So let's do this again. That was a lot of fun.
Thanks so much, Robert.
Okay. Take care.